Hopefully everyone's having a good morning so far. Let's see, I'm going to start. I wanted to kick off today talking about our financial assumptions, but I did have some follow-up from the last meeting and a couple of things on the question about where Missouri ranks and how our funding is. And so there was an article done by USA Today that Stacy reshared, and Missouri ranked 12th in that. 10th highest for roadway in poor condition, 18th highest for structurally deficient bridges. They even included locomotive derailments, 194 between 2015 and 2019. That put us 14th most out of 49 states. And then state highway spending per licensed driver was second lowest. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting perspective too. I've not seen that spending per licensed driver, but I know on other metrics we're often right at that second lowest or third lowest spot also. So maybe the answer is to license your drivers. No. So I just wanted to share that. And then Brittany also shared the Citizens Guide to Transportation that MoDOT puts out. And that's probably kind of the best source of how funding comes into Missouri and is distributed. And so I think a lot of you have probably had a chance to see that before. I just wanted to follow up on that. And so then getting right into our financial assumptions, I've got a meeting later today with both Zeke and Frank to kind of discuss how to show the MoDOT funding in our future years. But I did want to share kind of where we've been so far. So this table shows from 2016 for the MoDOT funding, what we've put into the TIP. This kind of goes forward to about 2026. But for our current years, and I apologize, I had realized when I started to do this, I put all the MoDOT numbers. MoDOT often shows their numbers in thousands. So, but then a lot of times we'll show our SDVG and everything in actual dollars. So please excuse the kind of alternating format there. But I did just want to show some of the factors that go into how OTO gets its money from the state is asset management. And a couple of years ago, this was actually referred to as taking care of the system, safety, and then STIP priorities, which has gone through a couple of different terminologies, I guess, from MoDOT over the years. It's been flexible funds, major projects and emerging needs, system funding, system improvements. And so really on our end, what we refer to that is our STIP priorities, that funding that we work through every year to help MoDOT program with funding that's left over after asset management. And so how that comes to us is based on a formula. And so each category has its own formula. Asset management, there's the condition of the system, safety, looks at crashes and other factors, and then the system expansion fundings based on population and employment and those sorts of factors. And so over the years, though, asset management is kind of gone, up and down as far as OTO share compared to the rest of the state. I guess you could say it's trended upwards, but each year that's not necessarily the case. For safety, it's kind of the same thing. And as our safety improves, that number does get a little bit lower. And then on the STIP priorities, this number, we have consistently received a higher percentage kind of going forward. And a lot of that is based on, the fact that we're growing maybe a little bit faster than the rest of the state, and this gets readjusted. And so these outer years, we'll probably kind of see that change a little bit as time moves forward too. And so when we talk about projecting funding forward, not only do we need to look at the idea that there may be more or less money, depending on how those assumptions that we want to make, every year coming to the state or down to OTO, but what our share of that funding would be. And then just briefly on the sub-allocated funding side. So our SDBG Urban, that's generally gone up over the years. We have a couple factors that impact that. There is a formula from the feds that comes down and is delivered through the states, but then also we have what's called the obligation limitation. So there is, I guess, a limit on how much of the actual allocation the state can obligate. And a lot of time, I mean, that's been as low, I think, sometimes in the past as like 92 or 93%. A lot of times our estimates for the year come in with a 96 to 98% obligation limitation. But then in 2020, I think that ended up actually being, and in 2019, 100% or more. And so it just kind of depends on where MoDOT's obligating funds in other categories around the state. And there's, I think, a little bit of kind of variability in how that works from year to year. And so 2021 actually was slightly less, not just for the obligation limitation, but the overall number from the FAST Act continuing resolution. We got just a fraction less than what we normally would have gotten if you compare that to 2019. And so that could still adjust up. We do have kind of that same variability in our TAP set aside. So you can see in 2019, 2020, some of that is based on changes again to the obligation limitation. But the FAST Act numbers are more kind of set at that 421,000. And then these local funding numbers are just the amount that would be required to match that sub-allocated funding. So that's just what 20% of all of that added together would be. And so I think we'll be able to demonstrate that. We've consistently in the TIP been able to demonstrate that our locals have more than enough funding available to match the funds coming to the area, whether or not that's how they choose to spend that money because of other priorities, but we do have that available. So I do show in here the Omnibus and the CARES Act funding that we've received over the last few years. Obviously this Omnibus funding, that's just something that's happened in the appropriations bill each year. And that's, something that's newer and probably we shouldn't maybe count on that going forward. This CARES Act funding is an amount that we was sub-allocated to us out of this last round, and we're still learning more about what can be done with that funding. It is slightly different than omnibus funding. And so also, if you look back at discretionary funds, I know we've submitted multiple applications over multiple years for build and infra and whatever variations on those names are. And Springfield was successful with their Grant Avenue Parkway project. And so kind of the next question becomes, how much of this kind of funding do we also want to maybe anticipate over the next 20 plus years? So those are just kind of some of the basics of how the money and the amounts that we've gotten over the last few years. I will say this very top row here is what we've put into the TIP, and you'll see it's just slightly different, but there is engineering funding and some other categories of funding that do come through that end up getting reflected in that, or sometimes it's carryover funding from prior years. And so those numbers often vary from TIP to TIP. But I guess I'll just stop there for a second. And are there any questions on any of those numbers so far?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you today, Kirk.
Well, that's good. our STIP priorities went down significantly, and what is that? Just the shift in MoDOT's prioritization?
Yes. So that's a shift in how the funding gets kind of distributed through that funding distribution that MoDOT does every year. And they've shifted from having a set number for taking care of the system that would be removed, and then all remaining funding would kind of go through the rest of those formulas. And now, and please correct me, MoDOT, if I am misspeaking, but now there is a number set for what it takes to meet asset management. And that's dealt with first, and then anything remaining after that gets distributed through the rest of that funding distribution. And so I guess in addition to that, if we are able to demonstrate that we can meet our asset management, any funding kind of remaining beyond those commitments, we can go ahead and use for system expansion. But it just kind of dedicates that funding to asset management first.
Okay.
And
That's a big shift, and I don't disagree with that. But it's huge. We went from almost 30 million to 2.
Yes. And we've been kind of, really watching how that works over the last few years, but you'll kind of notice when we have done our STIP prioritization process, we've still been able to move projects forward. But part of the conversation that I'm going to have when I meet with Frank and Zeke later is how we want to show this funding in our projections. Do we want to break it out by these categories, knowing that they are flexible and can shift over time as MoDOT priorities shift over time? And so we're kind of going to be looking at that. And the question is, is it more about just that overall funding number for our area?
Yeah.
And so I don't know if anyone from MoDOT wants to speak about how some of that shifted over the past few years, or Sarah, I know you've also done a lot of kind of digging into how these numbers have shifted.
Is Frank on the call?
I do not see him.
Okay. I don't, maybe Beth or Zeke, I of course can tell you my perspective, but maybe Beth or Zeke have, or even Brittany might have their perspective to share.
Looks like it might be you, Sarah.
Okay. Yeah, so the Highway Commission has, and I get a little political here, but to me, they've taken a very rural perspective on their decision making in recent years. There's been a lot of complaints about both Northeast and Northwest Missouri roads with under 400 vehicles a day being in bad condition. So they've chosen to focus a lot of investment by shifting. They've in fact approved a policy earlier this month that would shift funding from everyone else in the state to those areas in a couple of different ways. Then they also took the asset management, the funding that they felt needed to fund asset management, and have applied some inflation factors. So it started at 400, I think it was 435 million annually to over 700 million annually. So they've almost doubled the amount going to asset management. And a lot of that does go to getting those roads with under 400 cars a day in better condition. So, I can't speak to those needs. I can only speak to the effect that it has on us here locally, which is very, very significant.
Yeah, and some of those most recent funding decisions aren't even reflected here because they've been made since the last round of TIP and STIP information. So we'll be able to update that a little bit as we go to develop the TIP this year. So are there any other questions or thoughts about how our funding has shifted over the past few years. So I went ahead and just took this table back to 2016, which is when we adopted our prior plan.
It's a big change.
Yeah, and so some of what we'll have to look at as we develop the projections going forward is what that means for us. Also, I kind of love the unknowns. We always seem to develop a plan right before they do a new highway reauthorization bill. Not for, I mean, we've done continuing resolution, so there's been an opportunity to renew that before we do our plan, but we're going to have to make some assumptions about what that means for funding. Are we going to see increased amounts? I know they keep talking a lot about an infrastructure bill, but infrastructure these days also covers more than just roadways. And there's a lot of discussion from this administration about where to focus funding, whether it's to address climate change, other environmental or pollution areas, focusing on those environmental justice areas. And so there's a lot of, I guess, unknowns about what that means for funding to our region. So fun times on that. But we will work on finalizing those numbers. I think we can see how, over the years, while we always project low, we end up usually coming in around similar numbers year after year. And so we'll probably kind of take that into account also. And then just real briefly, and we'll look into this a little bit more too, but when we go to do our project solicitation, and I'm going to ask for project costs in current year dollars, but we're going to want to look at those inflation rates as well for how we grow the cost of projects that will happen later in the plan life. And so initially looking at the National Highway Construction Cost Index, the base year for that index is 2003, but you can kind of see in relation to that over the past 17 years. Second quarter of 2020 was the last officially published date for that. That index is about 2 right now. And so comparing that to just US inflation in general, that's kind of hovered annually from just over 1% to just over 2%. The consumer price index is right around 2. Social Security COLAs, which I know have nothing to do with the cost of transportation, have also been generally in that 2% range with the exception of 2018. MoDOT has historically inflated project cost by 3%. And it's important to note that on the revenue side, our fuel taxes are not currently indexed to inflation. So we know that that revenue side does not increase the way that project costs might. And so we'll also need to look at what number we use to inflate our project costs. And so just know that those will outpace probably the inflation in revenue that we'll see over that same time frame. So if there's any other questions or comments on that, otherwise I will move on to talk about the project solicitation, which I know that's kind of the biggest part of the plan every time is what projects go on that constrained list. Okay, so let me see here. What I have done is developed a survey of that you guys can fill out, and the initial screen will take you here, And I've set this up so that you only have to put in your contact information once. So if you go back to your email and you want to add more projects, all you have to do is say, yes, you've provided this, and it'll take you immediately to where you can enter in project information. But the first time you come into it, you're going to say no. And then what I'm asking for is who we should call at your agency with questions about your project submissions. If we need to clarify whether something in Ozarks on 6th Street or 6th Avenue, or if we're, not really sure kind of, exactly where something should go on a map, or if we have questions about a description, that sort of thing. It'd be great if we just had one person that we could call with those questions. So if you could fill that out for your agency, that would be great. And then you'll click Add Projects. And then this is just so we know who submitted what particular project. So that contact form is technically a separate entry and won't be tied to these. And so we're just asking basically who submitted the project. So just because it won't let me submit without answering that. Location, so these are, our members, and then area wide. And so if you can, specify where the project will be, give it a short, unique name. So some projects, whether they're along the roadway or if there's some other alignment or it's a new roadway or that sort of thing, if you can describe where that would be, whether it's like saying US 65 or Route AA, or a trail between here and here. And so, project from and project to, just kind of the starting and end points. That'll really help Dave when he goes to map all of the projects. And then if you can specify the type of improvement, and this will just kind of help us categorize later when we go to say, we have all of these needs, and here's, our unfunded needs and what categories they fall into. But go ahead and select all that apply. And then something that we're looking for, and so we can kind of kill two birds with one stone, but we're always looking for what we want to put onto that next list to go through the STIP prioritization process. What things we might want to look at for scoping, what needs to be prioritized next. And so if any of these projects that you submit, are I guess more short term, and you want them to be addressed in that STIP prioritization process, go ahead and say yes or no on that. Obviously, if it's a project you're not expecting to be done until 2040, probably not part of that process. And then provide a project description. Go ahead and describe, obviously if it's solely a bicycle or pedestrian project, and include that here. But then if it's a roadway project and you think you'll have these additional improvements with it, please go ahead and add that to your description. So anticipated year of construction, this will take you from 2022 to 2045. We do need to kind of categorize all of the projects by year of construction. And so the first 10 years, we absolutely have to basically do a year-by-year constraint. And so that'll be really important. And then beyond that, we will be able to put things into time bands, but we will also need to inflate according to those years. So that's really important that we have that information, even if it's just a really good guesstimate, that would be great. And then anticipated construction cost. If you have an idea, if you don't, we can maybe find some examples or other ways that we can help identify that amount. But if you have something where you think you might know what that cost is, please include that. And just current year dollars, and we'll worry about that inflation factor later. So then when you're done entering in that project, click yes, you have more projects to submit, because I'm assuming everyone's going to have more than one. And so you just say done adding project, and it will refresh and give you a new set to submit. And you just keep saying yes until you're done. And then when you're completely done adding in all your projects, still have to go ahead and answer that one. Click done. Thank you for completing this form. And then here's a link if for some reason you do need to come back and enter more projects again. So are there any questions on this? I wanted to kind of go over all of this and see if there are any questions or concerns about how the form's laid out. And then we'll put together an actual kind of detailed informational email for kind of what we're looking for, what to submit, that sort of thing. It should be pretty similar to what we've done in the past as far as this request goes. But we're just looking for enough information that we can land something on a map and then be able to start to pull in all of those things that we'll use to prioritize. And we're working on, kind of from our discussion, our last meeting, on putting together, kind of what those prioritization factors are going to look like, and we'll finalize all of that at our April 1st meeting. Okay, so there's no questions there. I know that makes for a really short meeting, but that's kind of what I had for today. I just wanted you guys to have an opportunity to see this form and basically know working through it, and just see if you had any questions. Sarah, do you have anything?
Yes. I just wanted to encourage everyone, I know the funding outlook is not stellar, but one of the things that we use these project lists for are to illustrate the needs that we have. And so out of the long range plan, I was able to say repeatedly that we have $600 million worth of needs that we have not been able to identify funding for. And I think that that is really helpful when talking to our state and our federal legislators. So I just wanted to encourage everyone to include every need you have, not only ones that you think can be funded.
Yeah. Plus, if you think you can only fund them, then it really doesn't give us any fun in the prioritization process. So, yeah, please do include everything. And, we did that last time too, and it was amazing how much we were able to check off the list. Even though initially, we thought we didn't have funding for things, we were able to find it along the way. And I think in my time at the OTO, and Sarah can probably confirm this too, we always think we're never going to have any money for things, and yet somehow it still keeps coming along. So yeah, be optimistic in what you submit, and that's a great point, Sarah. Thank you.
So are we going to include a section that identifies that funding per licensed driver and that we support moving to the middle?
Yeah, I think that was definitely one of the things that, when we talked about at the last meeting to include with our recommendations is how to advocate for more funding and to improve the funding situation for Missouri as a whole. So I think that was definitely a good thing to add to that discussion. And, and when we look at what those unfunded needs will end up being, that'll just kind of, I guess, confirm that need for additional money.
Okay, I just wanted to reinforce that desire.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and be looking for an email and start thinking about all the projects you want to submit. And I'm just going to let you know, on top of that, we're also going to be working with MoDOT to identify projects from the asset management plan and the safety plan and make sure that those kinds of projects are included as well. And then we will have to, once we set our projections, we'll also have to identify what portion of that's going to go towards things like operations and maintenance and other needs as well. So, but getting our project submitted is just kind of another step in that process. All right, well, thanks everyone, and have a good weekend. And for those on spring break next week, hopefully it doesn't rain the whole time.